Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and recently I've received a number of requests for help for students in a few important subjects. One of them is Aesop's Fables, and another is our English literature course, in which we're studying classical literature in English Literature 1 and in freshman high school English. So what I'd like to do is provide some resources to help students get started, because I think that once students get the hang of reading the classics and reading poetry, they won't need much more help. If help's needed, I'll continue, but I think this is just one of those things where students have to learn how to do it, and then um, once they once they see how it's done and get comfortable with it, then they can uh, wean themselves off of the help of a teacher, as it was, which is always the goal of learning. So I'm going to read through Homer's Iliad here. We're studying the translation of Alexander Pope in our English literature courses, and the reason why is because I want to emphasize to students that these epic works of classical literature were poems. They were not just novels or storybooks. And when we read prose translations, it really loses much of the achievement of the ancient classics. And so I'd like to read the works of Homer and Virgil and Ovid and Dante in English translation for the sake of English literature, but I would like to do so in poetic form, since these works are, in fact, poems. So we're going to read the English translation of Alexander Pope, and what's important to know about this translation is that it's written in what's called Iambic Pentameter, which is a form of poetry. Iambic Pentameter, and that name refers to the number of what are called feet in poetry, and the kind of foot that's used in this translation. So just to explain this by illustration from the text here, if we read the first line on the page, and I'm sorry that I'm going to be looking above the camera, so just bear with that. We read, Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring, of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess sing. And if you simply read the text slowly, always read poetry slowly, you'll begin to hear and feel the rhythm that's present in the text, and that rhythm is iambic pentameter. Now, what iambic means is that it's a foot, that is, it's a unit that consists of two, let's say, syllables. The first one is short and the second one is long. We could also say the first one is not stressed, the second one is stressed. So we see, if we were to characterize this foot of poetry, it could be characterized with the expression da-da, da-da, da-da. The first syllable short and unaccented, the second syllable longer and accented. So if we read this a little more slowly and with a bit more emphasis on the structure, focusing on these iambic feet, we would read, Achilles' wrath to Greece, the dire full spring. And you can hear that da-da, 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 da-da. That da-da is an iambic foot in poetry. And it's considered the epic form of, well, let me get to that in a minute. The second thing we'll notice in this line is that while the foot is iambic, there are 5 of them in each line. And the Greek word for 5 is where the word pentameter is derived from. So we have iambic feet, and we have 5 of them in each line. So listen, ready? Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. 5 iambic feet. That's what iambic pentameter means. So now listen as I read it with that in mind as we go through this. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. Of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore, devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom, and such the will of Jove. So you can hear those iambic pentameter lines. What I was about to say before is that iambic pentameter was considered the epic meter in English. So because the language is structured differently in Greek and Latin and in English, the meter that is most majestic, I guess we could say, is different between the two languages. In English, we have this iambic pentameter as the epic meter of the English language, whereas in Greek and Latin, we have a different meter. It's called dactylic hexameter. So take iambic pentameter, 5 measures in each line of iambic feet. And in Greek and Latin, we have what's called dactylic hexameter. Dactylic means the foot of the poetry in Greek and Latin epic poetry is like a finger. It's dactylic. And what that means, if you think about your finger, you have one long part of your finger that extends from the major knuckle out to the middle knuckle, and then you've got 2 shorter pieces. So the dactyl, or the finger, is one long and 2 short. And so let's say in Virgil's Aeneid, it starts out in Latin, and you can hear this meter: long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short. Arma virumque cano. So you can get that rhythm, the da 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 da. That's dactylic, and then there's 6 of those dactylic feet in each line. It's not always exactly dactylic, and I'm not going to get into that here, but the general meter of an epic poem in Homer and in Virgil is dactylic hexameter, 6 measures of dactylic feet. Here in this translation we're reading, we have iambic pentameter, which is 5 measures of iambic feet. So let's read together, having explained the form of this literature. Let's read together, and what I'd like to do, what most students are going to struggle with as they try to read the Iliad in English translation and in a poetic translation, they're going to struggle with knowledge of the history, of the characters, of events that are referred to, of the gods and goddesses and the religion. And what I'd like to do is read through this and provide some commentary to try and help students understand just enough to be able to move through these readings and get enough out of them for an English literature course. Realize that these ancient works were to their ancient societies what the Bible would be to Christian society. These were sacred books. They were considered to be inspired by the gods, and you'll see why in a minute. And the people read them as sacred writings. So you'll see there's so much information packed into these books. Most students, most teachers even would not be able to draw this out, because you have to be studying religion and philosophy and history and languages and all of the seven liberal arts. You have to know these things to see what's present in this classical literature. So let's read together, and I'll make some comments as I feel they'll be helpful for students as we go through. This is book 1 of Homer's Iliad, and just so you know, there are 24 books. We consider them long chapters, okay? 24 books of Homer's Iliad. This is book 1. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom and such the will of Jove. So let's unpack this a little bit. Homer here is opening this great epic poem, and we see the subject of this poem right at the beginning. Achilles' wrath. The wrath of Achilles. Achilles was a famous Greek warrior who we'll be studying about through this entire book. But he has this one quality that is his identifying or featured quality, and it's his wrath, his rage. And we're going to focus on this quality of Achilles, the wrath of Achilles. That's the subject of Homer's Iliad. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. And I want you to notice at the end of that second line, we find that this introduction is actually a prayer or an invocation. Homer is calling upon some unidentified goddess at this point. He's calling on this goddess to sing and reveal to us these events. That's what poetry was in the ancient world. The poet was considered an inspired writer or singer, and his message was understood to be brought to him and communicated through him by the gods. And so Homer, to open this poem, is invoking this goddess, whose identity we'll talk about at some point. He's invoking this goddess and asking her, heavenly goddess, to sing through him and to him of the wrath of Achilles, which was the direful spring, the terrible source of woes unnumbered, of countless evils. The wrath of Achilles was the source of countless evils, and he's invoking this goddess, praying to this goddess to reveal to us, to, spiritually remind us. It's a complicated idea, but remind us, sing to us, teach us of the wrath of Achilles. That's the opening 2 lines. And he goes on now to talk about that wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain. So the wrath of Achilles, what evil did it produce? Here Homer says, the wrath of Achilles, which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain. Pluto, that's the Roman name for the god Hades. He was the god of the underworld. So his gloomy reign is his kingdom of the dead, of the souls in the underworld. Achilles' wrath hurled into Pluto's gloomy reign. In other words, sent them to death. The souls of mighty chiefs, of great rulers, great princes, who were untimely slain, who were killed while still young by Achilles' wrath. Now, as we read this, like I said before, there is so much information, so much helpful information for us to read and reflect on and learn about classical society. For example, we see here in line 4 that Homer refers to souls, the souls of mighty chiefs. And we can see that Homer and the ancient Greeks in general, they believed that man was composed of body and soul, which many in our generation don't believe. These ancient writers were ahead of us in terms of understanding human nature. Homer clearly understands that men are composed of body and soul, and the wrath of Achilles cast their souls down to Pluto's gloomy reign. They believe in life after death. They believe that the soul continues to live after the body dies, that the soul is separated from the body and sent down to Pluto's gloomy reign. So we can see as we read this play, if we're thinking as we read it, not play, poem, if we're thinking as we read it, we'll find so much helpful religious information, philosophical information, both moral philosophy and natural philosophy. We'll find a lot of historical detail, and we'll also see just great examples of Homer's rhetorical mastery as he uses all sorts of rhetorical figures and imagery and illustrations to really add power and influence to his words. So that's why I say this book was considered, this poem was considered a sacred writing, an inspired book by which a person living in ancient Greece could receive a complete education, just as I would argue the Bible is today, if you actually study and meditate on it. So we're introduced to the subject. We already have content for meditation and reflection, and we're starting to learn about Greek philosophy, Greek religion, and so on. So I want you to see how much information is packed into this book. Let's keep reading here. Homer goes on to describe this situation. He says of the souls of mighty chiefs, whose limbs, unburied on the naked shore, devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. And we have to ask, why would he say that? Why is that mentioned? Because not only did these great chiefs suffer an untimely death, but it was a dishonorable death. Dogs and vultures tore their unburied bodies on the shore. Their bodies lie on the coast, and dogs and vultures tore them to pieces. They didn't receive an honorable burial, or they weren't burned as many ancient societies practice with regard to the dead. But instead of receiving any kind of honorable funeral or burial, their bodies were left unburied, and they were torn apart and eaten by dogs and vultures. These great chiefs, these great men of the ancient world were left for dead and torn apart by wild animals. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom and such the will of Jove. And here we have more names introduced to us. And this is the challenging part of reading classical literature, is that you have to learn who all these characters are. We have three names here: Achilles, Atrides, and Jove. Achilles is the main character of this story. We're reading of the wrath of Achilles. And what we learn is that there was strife between Achilles and someone else. We have this name Atrides. And what that name Atrides actually refers to is the father of this character. And I'm sorry if this gets confusing. But this other character who we're going to meet in just a little bit is Agamemnon, who was the king of Argos, one of the greatest kings of the ancient world. He was the leader of the Greek army as it invaded Troy in the Trojan War. Agamemnon was the son of Atreus. Agamemnon was the son of Atreus. And this name Atreides in Greek would mean the son of Atreus. And it refers to Agamemnon. So the strife between Achilles and Agamemnon, or between Achilles and the son of Atreus. Such was the sovereign doom, and such was the will of Jove. And here we have more on religion. Jove is just another case. If you've studied Latin or Greek, Jupiter was the nominative case of the name of the god. In Latin, it was Jupiter. In Greek, it was Zeus. He was considered the god of all gods, the great god. And what we see here of Jove, which shows us, again, if you've studied some classical grammar, Jove is the genitive form that's used here, of Jove. So Jupiter would be the nominative case name. Jove is here the genitive case name. They both refer to the same person, which is Jupiter, the great god of ancient Greek and Roman religion. And we read here, Homer tells us that this terrible suffering of these mighty chiefs of the ancient Greek world was the will of Jove for some reason. It was the will of Jove that these men be destroyed as a result of a strife or a quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon. And Homer here in this opening passage is asking the goddess to reveal this to us, to explain this to us, to help us to understand the wrath of Achilles and what Job's purpose was, Jove's purpose was in bringing about these evils upon the ancient Greeks. Homer goes on to say, continuing to read here, "Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung thee fierce strife, from what offended power Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead." So here we have this goddess identified. Homer says, "Declare, tell us, O Muse." This name Muse refers to an ancient goddess that was understood to inspire poets and musicians. It's where the word music and the word museum come from. So Homer is invoking this muse, this spirit of the arts, spirit of poetry. He says, "Declare to me, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife, from what offended power Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead." Explain to us, O Muse, what happened, what god or goddess was angered, who unleashed this dire contagion, this plague, upon the people, and left the camp, the Greek camp of soldiers, with mountains of dead men. What was the cause of this evil? Tell us. And he refers to Latona's son, and even in the note there you can see Latona's son, that is Apollo, one of the great gods of ancient Greek and Roman religion. So Apollo was offended by something that happened, and Homer is asking the muse to reveal to us what it was that happened, that angered Apollo, that caused him to unleash a plague upon the Greek people and leave mountains of the dead. The king of men, that refers to Agamemnon, because he was the great king at the time. He was the king of kings, as it were, speaking of human kings. The king of men, Agamemnon, his, that is Apollo's, reverend priest defied. The king of men, Agamemnon, Apollo's reverend priest defied, and for the kings offense, the people died. So Agamemnon committed some evil. He defied the reverend or the priest who is to be revered and honored of Apollo. And because of Agamemnon's disrespect to Apollo's priest, Apollo was angered and unleashed a plague upon the Greeks. And we'll see that that relates to an argument that broke out between Agamemnon and Achilles. For Chryses sought with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from the victor's chain. For Chryses, that is the name of the priest of Apollo, he came to Agamemnon. He sought with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter. So Chryses, the priest's daughter, had been captured by the Greek soldiers, and she was taken as a captive. That's why it said to free her from the victor's chain. She was being led around like a captive, a servant of the victorious Greek army. So the priest came to Agamemnon bringing costly gifts to try and ransom his daughter. Suppliant, the venerable father stands. And let me read that in the meter. Suppliant, the venerable father stands. Apollo's awful ensigns grace his hands. By these he begs, and lowly bending down, extends the scepter and the laurel crown. He sued to all, but chief implored for grace the brother kings of Atreus' royal race. So here we have this scene where Chryses, the priest of Apollo, comes before Agamemnon. Suppliant, we see, suppliant, the venerable father stands. This idea of suppliance in the ancient world was what it meant to present oneself before someone else, whether it's a god or a powerful person or anyone, to present oneself in a vulnerable position, in all humility, asking for mercy. That's the idea of a suppliant, one who comes before another, bows down before him, kneels before his feet, presents himself as vulnerable and completely dependent on the mercy of that other person, and makes some request for mercy. This priest, who is a reverend priest of Apollo, so let's think about this first. He himself is to be revered, and yet he comes with costly gifts, humbles himself before the feet of Agamemnon, and he begs. He begs for his daughter, and it says, Apollo's awful ensigns grace his hands. He bows before Agamemnon with the signs of his priesthood, the signs of his of Apollo, the god Apollo, in his hands, bowing down before Agamemnon. He extends the scepter and the laurel crown. These are the gifts he presents to Agamemnon. And he sued to all. In other words, he begged everyone to have mercy. But chiefly, he implored for grace the brother kings of Atreus' royal race. The brother kings refers to Agamemnon and his brother Menelaos, who was the king of Sparta. And we'll talk about them more as we go through this story. But he, the priest, Chryses, asks the Greeks for mercy, but specifically he prays to Agamemnon and Menelaos, the sons of Atreus, the brother kings, and begs them to be gracious, to be merciful to him, and grant him the ransom of his daughter in exchange for these gifts, but also in consideration of his role as a priest of Apollo. We then read, Homer goes on, and I'll try to make the meter of the poem more sensible. Ye kings and warriors, may your vows be crowned, and Troy's proud walls lie level with the ground. May Jove restore you when your toils are o'er, safe to the pleasures of your native shore. But oh, relieve a wretched parent's pain, and give Chryseis, that's his daughter, to these arms again. If mercy fail, yet let my presence move, and dread avenging Phoebus, son of Jove. So this is Chryses, and don't confuse Chryses the priest with Chryseis, his daughter. This is Chryses' prayer or begging to the Greeks for mercy. He says, first of all, as a priest, I pray to Apollo that your vows may be crowned, and Troy's proud walls lie level with the ground. May Jove restore you when your toils are o'er, safe to the pleasures of your native shore. So Chryses gives a blessing to the Greek people as a priest of Apollo. He says, may your vows be crowned, may your battle with Troy be successful, and may you all return home safely to your homes after the war. That's his blessing upon the people. But he makes this request. Relieve a wretched parent's pain, and give Chryseis to these arms again. That's his plea. Please let me have my daughter back. If mercy fail, if hearing this you have no mercy, let my presence move, and dread avenging Phoebus, son of Jove. And be careful, because Phoebus, that's just another name for Apollo, the son of Jove. Phoebus is an avenging god. And so he says, if you have no pity for me as I beg you for my daughter, then please consider the value of my gifts, and also consider the danger of offending Phoebus, Apollo, who is an avenger and will avenge any wrong done to his priest. So this is Chryses' humble, suppliant prayer to Agamemnon and Menelaus, begging for his daughter. Now what's the response of the Greeks? The Greeks, in shouts, their joint assent declare, the priest to reverence and release the fair. So all of the Greeks hear this request of Chryses, and they say, yes, grant him this request. Let his daughter be restored to him. But then Homer goes on and says, not so Atrides, he with kingly pride repulsed the sacred sire, and thus replied. So while all of the Greeks believed that Chryses should be granted his request, not so Atrides, not so Agamemnon, the son of Atreus. He, moved by kingly pride, and contrast that pride of the king with the humility of the priest, who is literally kneeling down before him. Agamemnon, it says, repulsed or cast off this sacred sire, this sacred father, this priest who is the father of this girl. And thus he replied, hence, that means get out of here. Hence on thy life, and fly these hostile plains, nor ask presumptuous what the king detains. Hence with thy laurel crown and golden rod, nor trust too far those ensigns of thy God. Mine, and listen to this disrespect, mine is thy daughter, priest, and shall remain, and prayers and tears and bribes shall plead in vain, till time shall rifle every youthful grace, and age dismiss her from my cold embrace. In daily labors of the loom employed, or doomed to deck the bed she once enjoyed. Hence then to Argos shall the maid retire, far from her native soil and weeping sire. So this is a most disgraceful response by Agamemnon. He says, get out of here or I'm going to kill you. Hence on thy life, he says to him. Fly these hostile plains, get out of here, nor ask presumptuously what the king detains. Whatever the king wants, the king gets. So don't presumptuously ask for it. Hence with thy laurel crown and golden rod, take your gifts and get out of here. And this, listen to this, nor trust too far those ensigns of thy God, and take your signs of Apollo's religion with you. So you can see how he provokes the wrath of Apollo. Nor trust too far those ensigns, those emblems or symbols of thy God. Mine is thy daughter, priest, and shall remain. Just disrespectful. Your prayers and tears and bribes shall plead in vain, until time shall rifle every youthful grace, and age dismiss her from my cold embrace. In other words, I will never give her up until I no longer want her. My cold embrace, that's when I will dismiss her, when she's older. When all of her youthful grace has been lost and I no longer find her pleasing, that's when you can look for her to return. She's going to be working in my house. She's going to be employed in the daily labors of the loom, weaving, or doomed to deck the bed she once enjoyed. So get out of here. To Argos, that is back to my city, this young maiden will retire, far from her native soil and far from her weeping sire. Just a disgraceful, disrespectful, heartless, arrogant response from Agamemnon. And this is the cause of the trouble that we're going to read about. So how does the priest respond? The trembling priest along the shore returned. So after humbling himself, bowing before Agamemnon, making himself vulnerable, he's sent away disrespectfully by Agamemnon and trembling. And we have to ask what it means that he's trembling. Is he trembling from fear because Agamemnon threatened to kill him? Or is he trembling with anger because he was so rudely treated by Agamemnon? The trembling priest along the shore returned, and in the anguish of a father mourned. Disconsolate, that means unable to be comforted. Disconsolate, not daring to complain, silent he wandered by the sounding main. And the main refers to the sea. Main is another name for the sea. So he's walking along the shore, trying to get away from Agamemnon because Agamemnon has threatened him. And he's disconsolate, in anguish, mourning, trembling. You can see all of this emotion that Homer's communicating here in the poem as this disgraced, suffering priest and father goes off without his daughter. So what does he do? So he goes on like this, walking away, keeping quiet, just trying to get away from Agamemnon, till, safe at distance, to his God he prays, the God who darts around the world his rays, that is Apollo, god of the sun. So Chryses prays finally, and this is his prayer. O Smintheus, another name for Apollo, O Smintheus, sprung from fair Latona's line, thou guardian power of Scylla, thee divine, thou source of light whom Tenedos adores, and whose bright presence gilds thy Chrysa's shores. If e'er with wreaths I hung thy sacred fane, or fed the flames with fat of oxen slain, God of the silver bow, thy shafts employ, avenge thy servant, and the Greeks destroy. Thus Chryses prayed. So Chryses prays to Apollo and asks Apollo that in consideration of his faithful service as a priest, consider all of my religious service, how I hung the wreaths in your worship and fed the flames with the fat of sacrificed oxen. If ever I have served you, hear my prayer and destroy these Greeks. So Chryses the priest prays to Apollo to destroy Agamemnon and his men. Thus Chryses prayed. The favoring power attends, that is, Apollo hears his prayer. Attends means to give attention to listen to. And from Olympus' lofty tops descends. Bent was his bow, the Grecian hearts to wound, fierce as he moved, his silver shafts resound. Breathing revenge, a sudden night he spread, and gloomy darkness rolled about his head. The fleet of Greek soldiers, in view, he twanged his deadly bow, and hissing fly the feathered fates below. On mules and dogs the infection first began, and last the vengeful arrows fixed in man. For 9 long nights through all the dusky air, the pyre's thick flaming shot a dismal glare. But ere the 10th revolving day was run, inspired by Juno, Thetis' godlike son, convened to council all the Grecian train, for much the goddess mourned, her heroes slain. The assembly seated, rising o'er the rest, Achilles thus the king of men addressed. So let's look carefully at that. And as I get through this, we're going to wrap up for this video because I don't want these to go too long. So Chryses prays his prayer, asking Apollo to avenge the embarrassment that he suffered from Agamemnon. And remember, only from Agamemnon. The Greeks were in favor of returning his daughter to him, but Agamemnon, moved by kingly pride, repulsed him, it said. He makes this prayer, Chryses, and Apollo hears his prayer. And from Olympus's lofty tops, Mount Olympus is a mountain in Greece, in southern Greece, and the religion of the Greeks taught that up on the top of this mountain, you can imagine this snow-capped mountain. If you've ever been near the mountains and you see the clouds can sometimes cover the tops of the mountains. It had an image to the people standing far below on the ground that the mountaintop was clothed in clouds and covered with snow, a place where the gods dwelt, up high on Mount Olympus. From Olympus's lofty tops descends Apollo. Bent was his bow. Bent was his bow. That means that he had pulled back his arrow and he was ready to shoot. His bow was bent and ready to shoot. Bent was his bow, the Grecian hearts to wound. Grecian means Greek. Fierce as he moved, his silver shafts resound. That is, in his quiver, his arrows, which are made of silver, were rattling around in his quiver. Breathing revenge, he was angry by Agamemnon's treatment of his priest. A sudden night he spread, darkness covered the place. And with the fleet in view, with all of the soldiers, all of their ships, remember they're on the shore, all of their ships are anchored at the shore, and all the men are on the coast. With the fleet in view, he twanged his deadly bow. That is, he fired the arrow, and the twang of the string was sounded as he fired the arrow. Hissing fly the feathered fates below. Hissing, the sound of the feathers of the arrows flying through the air. On mules and dogs, so the infection, the plague that Apollo sent upon the people first infected the animals, the mules and the dogs. So it spread among the animals. And at last, the vengeful arrows fixed in man. For 9 long nights through all the dusky air, the pyres, that is the funeral fires that were burned to burn the dead bodies that had died of the plague, the pyres, thick flaming, shot a dismal glare. So 9 days this plague just destroyed the Greek army and killed heaps and heaps of soldiers, and they were burning the bodies to try and fight this plague as it filled the fleet of the Greek soldiers. But ere the 10th revolving day, so before the 10th day of the plague, Achilles calls all the Greeks together. It says that he's inspired by Juno. Juno inspired him to do this. So imagine you're one of these Greek soldiers. You have no idea what's going on. All of a sudden, everyone's dying. There's some kind of disease that's broken out in the camp. Everyone's dying. There's all of this chaos and tragedy. And then all of a sudden, Juno, the goddess, inspires Achilles. She puts it in his mind to gather the Greeks together and try to figure out what's going on. We're also told that Achilles is the god-like son of Thetis. Thetis is another of the goddesses, and she is Achilles' mother. So Juno inspires Achilles to call the Greeks together because Juno was mourning because the Greeks were being killed. She loves the Greeks. The assembly gathered together, and rising o'er the rest, standing up and over the other Greek men, Achilles addressed the king of men, that is Agamemnon. So Achilles calls all the Greeks together, and when they're all gathered together and seated, he stands up and he speaks to Agamemnon. And this is where the quarrel or the strife between Agamemnon and Achilles begins. So, this video, we're already approaching 50 minutes, so I'm gonna wrap up here. But I hope you can see how the poem is to be read as far as the English meter is concerned in Iambic Pentameter. Remember, that's da-da, 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 da-da. You'll see some lines are easy to read. Other lines are a bit more difficult, and I'm not going to get into rules for reading poetry or things like that. It's something we can study in rhetoric, and we study it actually in grammar when we get to prosody, which is the last part of grammar, but we'll talk about it here and there as we read through it. But I want you to see that the basic sound and feel of iambic pentameter and get used to that. You see how I read it slowly, and when you read it slowly, it's not too confusing. And you just see that there's a lot of information packed into these lines, and that's why it's difficult to read. And there's no secret way around it. You've got to learn a lot of information about Greek and Roman history, about Greek mythology, philosophy, geography. There's just a lot of information that needs to be learned, and that's what I'd like to try and help you with as we read through this book. So we're going to cut off there. And so far we read the introduction where Homer invokes the muse to inspire him as a poet and sing through him the history of the wrath of Achilles and the suffering of the Greeks as Apollo avenges his priest who was disrespected by Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks. So I hope that's helpful. What I'd like you to do is go back now and read over that part of Book 1 that we've worked through so far. Read it for yourself. Practice reading with iambic pentameter. Practice reading with the meter of this poem, and see that you understand the content. Read it slowly. This is not a storybook. This isn't like reading Lord of the Rings where you're just reading a novel. This is a poem. It's very rich. The information is packed in there. The language is intense. And you have to learn to read poetry. It's slow reading, slow reading. So read it carefully, practice the meter, and try and remember the detail that we've talked about in this video. We'll continue like this through this book. I'll make these videos as often as I can. If I need to go through the whole book, I will, time permitting. So we'll get started here with this first video. Read it for yourself and see how things go. If you have any questions, please send them to me. I'd love to know what you struggle with, what you find difficult. Let me know, because sometimes we just see things differently. I'm very comfortable with these readings because I'm a classicist, but I don't expect students to understand all these things. And if there's something that you're struggling with, please tell me, because I might just not be aware of it. All right? I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.